So it's day one of the bread and butter journey, and it's gonna be a big one. Day one is really where most of the foundation is laid down for what will be the perfect bread and butter experience on day three. And the first thing I'm gonna get moving on is this cultured butter. Now to make butter, of course you need some good heavy cream. This cream is from Battenkill Farm Valley in upstate New York, which is the best possible product I could get my hands on, which then in return will give me the best possible butter I can make. I'm gonna use 3 quarts of heavy cream, mainly because that's what I can fit in one of these Cambro containers. And that leftover quart ended up going to very good use. I had some frozen peaches from this summer that I defrosted. I made a nice vanilla custard base with some sugar, eggs, and that cream. Blended in those peaches, threw it through my Ninja Creamy, and this turned into one hell of an ice cream. The next process I'm gonna be doing is culturing this cream, which then gives you that cultured butter. And to do that, I'm using plain yogurt, which is very important that it's plain, and it also contains live active cultures, which will then culture or ferment this cream. I'll mix in a few tablespoons of the yogurt to the cream and let that sit at room temperature for a few days to ferment and culture. So now that that cream is doing its own thing and culturing for a few days, I can start working on my bread, which starts with my starter. And this starter is completely depleted. It's been hanging out for a few days at room temperature, so you can see that it's desperately craving some more food to get super active. So I'll take out a fresh container to make my levain. I'll dump in a few tablespoons of that spent starter, and then I'll mix in some flour and water until I get a cake batter consistency just like this. And then I'll let that activate and double in size, which should take a few hours. Now I still have about a cup left over of this spent starter, which is just super fermented, soury goodness. So in my house, this rarely goes to waste.
Yeah.
You have leftovers and you can really take
The kimchi ages well.
Yeah.
All right, so after around 5 hours, my sourdough starter is nice and active and ready for some bread baking. And since I'm really treating myself here to the perfect loaf, I'm gonna be milling up some fresh flour. Now, do I always mill my own flour? Absolutely not. But I will say, if I do have the time and energy to do it, there's no comparison to the levels of flavor and freshness you get when you're using that fresh milled flour. So what I have right here is 100% whole grain flour, which can be baked with in this form, but the final bread product would be a little grainier. It wouldn't rise quite as nice, so I like to send it through just a basic sifter, which removes a good bit of that outer bran of the wheat berry, leaving me with a slightly more soft and more refined flour. Now, this whole wheat flour will make a very nutritionally packed and flavorful bread, but I generally don't bake with just this flour. I mean, as you can see, it's not an easy thing to produce. Plus, for me, it's very hard to get away from that super fluffy crumb that realistically can only be achieved by adding in some of that store-bought white flour that's just a more refined product. And the exact ratios I'm using for this sourdough are right here on this screen. Now keep in mind, I have years of experience of handling higher hydration doughs. So if you are more of a beginner with sourdough, I would suggest lowering your hydration levels about 5 to 10%, basically using less water to make your dough a little bit easier to work with. So my dough has rested for about 20 minutes, which is when I can start doing my stretch and folds. Now again, since I've built a very long relationship with handling and working a more wet dough like this, I prefer working my dough on a board with zero additional flour. Just a bench scraper and a little water to make my hands more non-stick. Actually, in my sourdough course, I teach both the beginner method that uses additional flour in this stage and the advanced method with no flour like I'm doing here. And in total, I'll be doing around 3 to 4 folds with 20-minute intervals in between, but really there's no exact science to it. It's all about a feel of how that gluten is continuously developing every single fold that you do until it starts to feel stronger and it starts holding its shape. All right, it's a new day, and like I mentioned yesterday, most of the heavy lifting has been done, so today is gonna be pretty simple. The first thing that's very exciting is I get to check in on how this heavy cream is culturing. And you can see it's slightly thickened on the top, but just underneath that layer is still very liquidy, and it's just starting to build some tangy notes from the fermentation, but it still needs time. After about 20 hours in the fridge, my dough has doubled in size, but I'm not relying at all on time here. Temperature in your house, the activity levels of your starter, these are all variables that will completely change how your dough rises at home, which is why I love these Cambro containers, because I can just rely on volume. When that dough has doubled in volume, I know that bulk rise is done and I'm ready to move on. I'm gonna first split this dough right in half and give it a very rough shaping to start building the final shape of these loaves. After 20 minutes of this dough resting, it is time for the final shaping. And there are so many methods and techniques for shaping bread. It used to give me a lot of anxiety just seeing all these professionals whip up bread so fast. And that's really what separates the professionals from a home baker. It's just repetition. If you're doing this all day long, you're gonna naturally be very good at it. But as a home baker, even if I'm baking bread, say once or twice a week, that's generally not enough practice to really perfect this, which is why for me, I have simplified this process. I just use a simple tension pull technique, which I can easily replicate, and the loaves generally come out very nice. And this is really the first time in this shaping process that I'm introducing more flour to the dough. And I do not skimp on the flour here. The last thing I would want is to spend 2 days making bread just for that bread to stick to your proofing basket and completely ruin your final bread loaf. So we've made it to day 3, and shit is going down today, my friends. It's baking day and it is butter making day. So the first thing I'm gonna do is get that Dutch oven preheating, and I can check in on this fermenting cream. Now that's what I'm talking about. 3 days in for me, and it is completely thickened. But of course, this will depend on variables like your ingredients that you're using and the temperature of your room. So what I've done here is transformed this heavy cream into creme fraiche. Now keep in mind, a sour cream is a very similar product. I mean, it's called sour cream. But because I used a very high fat content cream, I have a thicker and creamier creme fraiche versus a slightly thinner sour cream. But either way, we can now make our cultured butter. I'll dump in the cultured cream into my stand mixer and get that whipping on high speed. After a few minutes, it's gonna fluff up a bit and turn to a cultured whipped cream. Then a few minutes later, you can start seeing that cream getting a little greasy greasier, which is when I will slow down the mixer just a bit. And once you start seeing liquid kind of being shot out of the mixer, that's when you know your cream is about to break, which is what we actually want in this case. Complete separation of those butterfat solids from the buttermilk, which I'll then strain off. And cultured buttermilk is one of my favorite products to have on hand. I'll use this to make dressing, all types of baked goods, but my favorite thing to make are fermented sourdough buttermilk waffles. I'll usually make a big batch of these at once because they freeze so well. And then you have these sort of gourmet, extremely delicious Eggo waffles that are much easier to digest with all of that fermentation involved. Now this butter is not done. I still have to wash out all of the residual buttermilk. If you don't do this step and some of that buttermilk gets left behind, your butter's gonna spoil a lot faster. We need just that pure butter fat. And I found the easiest way to do this is just to run the butter under cold water and continuously work it with your hands, which slowly works out all of that excess buttermilk. And you know that's happened when the water in your bowl starts running completely clear. Now the final thing I need to do is just finish off this butter with a little bit of salt to season it, and it's ready to package up. And I do like making butter in large batches because it's a more intensive process and it freezes very well. So I'll package some up to eat fresh this week, and I'll send a few packages off to the freezer for the winter. So my loaves got another 20 hours in the fridge for a cold proofing. Now you don't have to extend the process of fermentation this long, but the reason I like doing this cold bulk rise and this cold proofing in the fridge is because yeast will slow down in these cooler temperatures, which of course then will slow down the rise of your bread, but there's still a ton of bacterial development that continues to thrive in colder temperatures, which I find gives you a much more complex and dynamic flavor of your final bread. One thing I've learned about cooking over time, this is pretty classic for a lot of chefs and home cooks, is that things tend to simplify over time. When I started cooking, since I had less skills and I had no clue how the quality of ingredients actually impacted the food, I would tend to add more to things, thinking that more was better and that would enhance the experience. But as I've tuned in on my skills and focused on quality of products, I've learned to simplify. And it's amazing that something as simple as bread and butter can hold up to any culinary experience out there.